Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. In order to begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways throughout Australia and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I also extend that to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander guests joining us from around the country today. I'm coming to you from Meanjin or Brisbane on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara peoples. And I'd also like to acknowledge the ongoing impact of colonisation on First Nations Australians, including the disproportionate impact of substance use on their health and well-being. My name's Ben. I'm an educator here at Insight, and it's my pleasure to be introducing our presenter today, James Hoey, who's just appearing on the screen. James is the program manager here at Insight, and he's a psychologist by trade. Today, he's going to be speaking with us about exploring contingency management as an approach in AOD treatment. We always really love to hear your comments and questions through these webinars, so please make sure that you type them in the chat if you're joining us from webinar land. There's a few people in the room as well. And I'll ask as many questions as I can on behalf of the people in the chat at the end of the presentation. Just so you know, you won't be able to see other people's comments in the chat, but please rest assured that they do all come through to the hosts. Thank you, and over to you, James.
Good morning, and thank you, Ben. I'd also like to add my acknowledgement to the traditional custodians in the land, which we're meeting here in Brisbane, in Meanjin, and also acknowledge the lands and waterways to which everybody is coming to us out there in webinar land this morning. So we're joined by an audience here in Byalla here in Brisbane, and also by everyone out there online. So thank you very much for coming along and for listening in. That's really kind of lovely to have you here. So our topic today, as kind of promoted, talking about contingency management and exploring that as an approach in AOD. This is something that I've had some interest and curiosity in for a long period of time, because I first came into contact with the approach of contingency management when I was working in a youth organisation a couple of decades ago. Don't have to go into detail around that, but where it was that prior to me starting with that organisation, they had previously run in the not that distance past a therapeutic community approach day program for young people with substance use concerns. And they had actually run parallel with that a contingency management program. However, what I was informed at that time was that they were no longer doing that because contingency management didn't work. And I'll come back to that particular statement and some of the deeper unwrapping of that in a few moments' time. But then my other involvement with that was working for many years in both the original Queensland Drug Court and then the reinstated Drug Court, that you often will find literature that talks about drug courts employing these types of approaches because they have regimes of rewards and sanctions or positive and negative consequences based on particular behaviour or adherence to particular expectations of those programs. Whilst contingency management is a word that often gets thrown around in that setting and in that type of treatment approach, I would add again, which I'll unpack as we go through, I would say that it's probably not pure contingency management as we see it today. It's a bigger behavioralism type approach, but let's talk about that as we go through. So what are we doing today? Where are we going to go? Don't know if anyone's here, hands up in the room, or just hands up out there, or wherever you are. Have you ever done one of those kind of like 12-day tours of somewhere? Up here is a 12-day tour, the itinerary for a 12-day tour of Europe. They're fast, they're great, they give you that overview. It's like, here's the amazing historical centre of Rome. It's massive, it's got all these things, be back at the bus in an hour. Well, that's kind of what we're doing. A bit of an introduction so that if there are things that you're interested in, you can go back to look at them and explore them further. So we're going to look at some terms first up in our time together. We're going to look at some examples because I think it's always easier to show and to give kind of a bit of a meat on the bones around what we're talking about rather than just focus too much time on the theory. We're going to do a little bit of a demonstration here, and I have a willing sort of audience here in the room. I'll explain a little bit more about that, because never let a good practice activity go by when we're trying to learn something and retain it. And also look at this point around the evidence and where that's at. And finally, when we get back at the end of our little 12-day whip around highlights of contingency management tour, we're just going to look a little bit at, well, what are some of the challenges? Because I have no doubt as we talk today, or you might already have come today with some thoughts, with some notions, with some already kind of, I guess, views around this particular topic based on your past experiences, what you've read, what you've heard, similar to me when I first started, and it's like, yeah, it didn't work. So a couple of things about terms today that might be interesting. We'll hopefully learn a few new ones or consolidate some ones that you already know. We're going to be using these sort of throwing these terms around, things like a contingent behavior or target behavior. Those two terms can be used interchangeably. What that's about is that it's a specific behavior that contingency management is aiming to promote or increase the frequency of, is what that's about. We're going to see this word incentive, sometimes interchangeably used with the word reward. What that's about is that it's something that's given as a positive reinforcement to try and help increase the frequency of that aforementioned contingent or target behavior. You're also going to hear probably a bit of a newer term that maybe isn't in some of the existing treatment literature about reset. That is, it's a kind of a process in contingency management that refers to restarting a reinforcement schedule or lowering a reinforcement schedule after a target behavior has not occurred or is not present. And the final term, very, very important one to know, is this particular one, non-loso. If you're not sure of what that one means, it's actually Italian for when I say non-loso. If you ask a question and I look confused, it's me saying, I don't know about that one. I'm not sure, or hopefully I'll be able to find out for you, because this is a really big topic. Revisiting it again this year for a number of different reasons, I realized kind of how big this is. So, contingency management. Dr. Nancy Petrie is somebody who's a big writer in this area of contingency management, a particular approach as well. I'll be talking about that one today. But there's a bit of a quote from Nancy up the top there, that it's based on the principles of operant conditioning, which is where it comes from, those foundations and roots of behavioralism. So where that kind of begins is you've got the work of Thorndike in kind of the late 19th century. Really, he wrote the big sort of treatise around law of effect, looking at the way that animals solve puzzles to be able to get rewards. That work was picked up on by Skinner, B.F. Skinner, in the 1930s. He created the operant chamber. Some of you might be, or the kind of Skinner's box, sometimes it's called colloquially, where again, there was these rewards and lack of rewards, extinction reinforcement, and other types of negative reinforcement sometimes, where it is that depending on the activity of the rats in pushing levers and things, lots of things on lots of YouTube clips, lots of things around that if you're looking at it. But the basic moving into sort of Skinner's era, and after he built on Thorndike's work, what he really identified is that depending on the outcome of a particular behavior, whether it was something that, added something that was a warm fuzzy, basically, or a positive, so it added a reward, or it removed something that was unpleasant. In both of those conditions, the positive reinforcement and the negative reinforcement, you are going to see an increase in the likelihood of a particular behavior. And we'll talk more about this as we go through. But it's important to probably just get a little bit of a refresher if this is a 101 for you, because then we also have punishment. Now, punishment isn't cruel and unusual. We often have a bit of a reaction to that word. In operant conditioning or behavioralism language, a punishment is anything that's likely to decrease the frequency of a behavior. If when that is operated in that comes into operation, that the consequence or the end result is there's usually going to be a reduction. So you have positive punishment, which is adding a punishment. You have negative punishment, which is taking away something that is desired or wanted. In contingency management for alcohol and other drug treatment. My perspective particularly is quite strong on this one because it's also represented across the literature, that we really only are talking about positive reinforcement, that a good AOD program using this approach is wholly focused on adding the positives where it's possible, not using those other three types, not using punishments. Not adding punishments, not taking away things that a person already has that are desired. An example of negative punishment is, removing the PlayStation, from someone in terms of trying to change a behaviour. So, which is why I think, as I mentioned before, my involvement with drug courts, they use fairly much all of those different types of conditions to be able to work with the behaviours they're looking at. So in terms of definitions of contingency management, which is staying in this kind of first part of our little tour around 12-day tour of multiple countries, contingency management, this is coming from some work done last year in the US. It's a behaviourally based intervention that uses tangible rewards to reinforce positive behaviours in substance use recovery. And when used for substance use disorders, contingency management incentives are a form of treatment because their purpose is to reinforce abstinence from substances. There's a few words I'm going to probably keep using here for a little while, but we'll have an opportunity to explore some of these because often this topic, like actually quite a few other AOD treatments, tend to often result in some emotional responses, and particularly if you're having conversations with people. So we're talking about abstinence at the moment in this definition. And reinforce other recovery-related or oriented behaviours such as attendance at treatment, counselling or medication adherence. And as we'll see, there are other incentives as well. So just a couple of other things before we dive into looking at some examples. Contingency management is usually not something that is delivered as a standalone. It's usually something that is combined with other types of interventions. I don't think I've seen anything that's really solely contingency management based. I'm sure it's kind of out there, but in terms of what's been studied and researched and written about. So we have a lot of research. Carol there, who talks about how those combinations of things like MI and CBT and other types of approaches, that's just a couple. We also see some of the mechanism of that is that contingency management on its own is not going to get to the root of difficulties or challenges or potentially sort of upstream issues that people might have, that those other approaches like case management, psychosocial interventions are incredibly important as well and usually walk alongside this particular intervention. There's two main approaches. Dr. Stephen Higgins, a psychologist in the 70s over on sort of the East Coast of the US. He first wrote about voucher-based, and when we're talking about approaches here, talking about approaches in working with problematic alcohol and other drug concerns. So he started writing about a voucher-based approach to contingency management. And then because of some of the challenges predominantly with funding, which again we'll explore, Dr. Nancy Petrie, again, another psychologist, much kind of later on, started writing about a prize-based approach. So rather than go into all the theory of those, I'm going to show you some examples. The first one I'm going to show you is from California. Now, this one has been running for 2 years. So phase one's sort of been over sort of actually late 2022, that should say, not 23, through to July 24 this year. They've just actually hosted a webinar, which I'll show you a link to if you're interested in watching it, to report back to the Clinical Trials Network on some of their early findings. Nothing's in print yet because it's still so early, but this is an initiative that was introduced in California, and it was actually quite a large trial. It's already seen over 3,000 people, is what they reported on in September. It's 24 counties and 160 sites that they're delivering this from. So there's a hint there that contingency management, I didn't mention before, but it's been around. There's 3 decades or more of research on this particular intervention. It's becoming something that is generating a lot of interest around the world in a lot of jurisdictions and also in Australia. And I'll be talking about that as we get towards the end. So the case management approach, this is a voucher-based approach, and their protocol was 24 weeks of intervention. The contingent behaviour, the target behaviour, and the frequency of measuring that, because if whenever you've got a target behavior that you're trying to change, you need to have a verifiable and observable way to manage it. If you're going to use incentives and rewards to try and increase the frequency of it, because it can go not particularly well if we're reinforcing things that are not necessarily what is desired. So the contingent behavior with this particular program was a voluntary program, was stimulant negative urine drug screens. And that was measured in weeks 1 to 12. There were 2 urinalysis tests done, so urine samples taken at least 72 hours apart. And in weeks 13 to 24, so kind of like splitting or tapering the intervention, urine tests were collected once per week. So that was how the target behavior, the contingent behavior was measured on in an observable, verifiable way. So what were the incentives? Now, just to let you know as well that this was also alongside group work and counselling and things like this, but this was what was added to the treatment as usual protocols. So what were the incentives? Well, during weeks 1 to 12, in week 1, for every test that did not have the presence of a stimulant, so predominantly cocaine and methamphetamine were the ones that were being looked at, there was $10 received. So $20 could be achieved in the first week of the program. Then in weeks 2 to 12, $1.50 was added to that. So if in week 2 you provided a test that was clear to the substances that were being measured, it would be $11.50. So it'd be $23 you'd get by the end of that week. The maximum reward in the first 12 weeks of the program then that someone could achieve is $438. And that was delivered via a reloadable card. That was kind of loaded on using a program called Incentives Manager, which I have downloaded onto my phone because I was curious about it, but it looks kind of big and scary. Then for the second part, weeks 12 to 24, and take note of this because we'll refer back to this at the end in terms of adaptations to contingency management, because this was a really good example, sorry, just to take an aside for a moment, because it's one that's just like started only 2 years ago. It's still currently running. And they're looking to aim to double the numbers. They've already got to kind of 3,000 through this. And it's using a lot of the adaptations that have been found to bring contingency management into a more contemporary era. So I won't go through those now because we'll talk about that at the end. In weeks 13 to 18 then, it was once per week. So the ability to incentivize that behavior, to give the incentive and the reward was just once per week, and people received a flat rate there of $15. Weeks 19 to 23, 10. So notice there's this kind of gradual tapering. Just take note of that. Then in the final week, for a test that was clear of any stimulant substances, it was a incentive that could be used, not cash, but loaded onto the card to purchase certain items. So your maximum reward for the second part was 161 with an aggregate over 24 weeks for a full range of clear tests would be 599. Interesting number. If anyone wants to ask a question about that, I'm happy to answer it because it's probably not what you're expecting. But moving on, the program, remember that word reset I mentioned before? The program had a reset so that following a positive stimulant result or a missed unexcused test, what happened was the incentives reset back to the original week 1 for the first 2 tests that then became were clear. So $10. But again, keep this in mind because this is where some of the contemporary adaptations, after that consecutive 2 tests, a person was reinstated back to the level that they were at previously. They didn't have to go back through the whole sort of week 1, week 2, week 3. So that's important to kind of note in some of the adaptations. So what were the results? Well, like I said, nothing's in print yet, and these are very early, not peer reviewed, but they hosted a webinar in September, so just 2 months ago, to the Clinical Trials Network. It was the UCLA Integrated Substance Abuse Program who were kind of like managing this particular trial, and they found of the tests that they had performed, that the ones that were clear of stimulants was 96%, and when you took out the unexcused absences, you were looking at clear tests of 74%. Satisfaction rate in terms of answering the question, did this program help me to stop using stimulants? The satisfaction rate for that was 93%. So some interesting findings, but very early days. So another particular one, just really talking about the interest in this particular intervention, and some of the reasons for that I will explain, but no bigger, this is probably the biggest trial that's ever happened kind of in the world around contingency management for substance use, is the US Department of Veteran Affairs, where over the last 10 years, they've been running a contingency management approach. Now, the one I just showed you before was the voucher-based. So the original one that Stephen Higgins kind of, created up and has worked through and promoted out there and is used in alcohol and drug treatment. This one actually uses the prize-based approach. So this was the Nancy Petrie kind of adaptation that came about, and Nancy Petrie and co, who started to look at, because what some of the challenges were and the things that were turning people off contingency management was the cost as one thing. So this was for a number of reasons, but one of the primary drivers was to create this prize-based protocol, then to research it, and has been extensively researched, with a view to bringing down the actual kind of funding issue and costs. So that was one of the drivers around this. Here's an example of the current US Department of Veteran Affairs. They've had over 6,000 people through this program. It's been running in 94 different sites since kind of the early 2010s and that sort of period of time, and there's some big papers written up about it. It uses this fishbowl approach. So what's that? And this is, sometimes you often see this in some of the drug courts. And in fact, the Victorian Drug Court currently uses this approach. What that is and here's a standard protocol. It may not be the one that's used everywhere, but there's going to be 500 prize slips within the bowl, the fish bowl. That's literally what it is. 500 prize slips, of which there's a 50-50 ratio. So that 250 of those tickets, when drawn, or if someone draws one of those particular 250 tickets, that are going to have an affirming message on it, something like good job. So 209 have a smaller prize value in this particular Veteran Affairs program. I did read something last year that said that they were going to increase the small value from 1 to 3, but I haven't seen that confirmed anywhere, because they were starting to realize that $1 was, not necessarily at a magnitude that would necessarily kind of influence or have that kind of effect on behavior. 40 have a larger prize value of $20, and then there's one jumbo of $100. And these were using redeemable vouchers, particularly with the Veterans Canteen services, which were usually also co-located with the treatment centres. And again, it's not standalone. People had an option of engaging in family intervention, therapy, group counselling. So contingency management is usually delivered as a sort of an adjunct to other types of treatment. So what was the contingent behaviour and the frequency of measurements? Similar to what we saw in the large California trial that's currently happening. It was really focused on stimulant negative urine screens. Again, in the 12 weeks of the intervention, measured at least twice in that period of time, 72 hours apart. The incentives, people earned a prize draw. So they could pull a ticket, and you can see the schedule of incentives up there. But it was one of these that, like we saw with the voucher-based, increases in monetary value or equivalent monetary value occurred with consecutive tests as a bonus if they were negative. Same happens with this, is that the number of draws increases with consecutive negative tests, up to a maximum of 8. So somebody by probably week 4 or 5, if they've had consistently negative tests, can be drawing out of the fishbowl there 8 tickets. So increasing obviously the ratio of the response of a positive outcome. Average payout, as you can see, quite kind of contained, which is why this one was an adaptation, with a potential in terms of aggregate maximum of $364. The reset for this one, not unlike the one before, was if there was a stimulant positive urine drug screen returned, if there was a missed or unexcused absence from providing a urine test, then it reset back to one draw, and then increasing draws, resuming for consecutive negative results. So back on that kind of schedule again. Wow, so you're doing really well if you're kind of hanging in there. And this was Philippus study. There's also been a more recent one published this year, 2024, on this particular trial between 2018 and 2022, but it was a little bit more about how they managed COVID. It's in the giant list of references at the end of this if you get the PDF. It's a Coghlan study, is the main author on that. So yeah, so what else do we have happening? So far we've been talking about, and like I said, there might be some emotional things happening for people with this constant kind of reference about testing and abstinence and all these sorts of things. Let's kind of hold on to those and certainly have a conversation as we go through today. But I just want to let you know, and this is just a very quick example, I won't go through all of it, I'll speak to it. There's another great study that was done by Dr. Nancy Petrie, who's been involved in the prize-based approach since well, she was the kind of the originator of it. And it was looking, it's a sort of a study of about 360 across 2 states in the US. It was Vermont and Connecticut, looking at over a 5-year period from about 2010, 2015. The research was published in 2018. They reinforced the contingent behavior was attendance, not clear tests. So that's what they were looking at. So as opposed to what we know we saw with the other 2 studies, the effect and the impact. Oh, I didn't mention as well, the veteran study in the 2018 paper, the negative result tests were at 91.1% in terms of tests that were provided and returned during the primary treatment period, that kind of 12-week intervention. The other one was around that sort of like in the 90s. That was for a 24-week. For this particular one, because it was about attendance, that was the target behavior. Just a little hint there, with contingency management, it's not good to have lots of multiple behaviors because it's very hard to get everything kind of happening in your life, particularly if you're in early treatment and trying to make changes. The recommendations are to, you target what you need to target. Target something that's going to be important. Target maybe where you're having issues. If it's attendance at your, if people are having attendance issues, contingency management for that. If it's about people who want to stop using and are having difficulty, then make that the target. But as you'll see there, because this had a couple of arms in the study, they looked at contingency management applied for attendance for a shorter period of time, 6 weeks, and then 12 weeks. A couple of other versions they had as well. Overall, the findings were that the 12 weeks was more effective in terms of attendance, that during the primary phase, it's not written there, but it focusing on attendance only actually had an effect on reducing substance use rates as well. So doing that during the primary treatment phase. At follow-up, that didn't necessarily sustain. There was definitely kind of a reduction in that rate around people not using. Interestingly, conversely, the other side doesn't work out. If you are what I was going to say, where you get the positive effect and the duration of the effect, if you're looking at abstinence or reduction in use, that seems to affect attendance really well. But it doesn't necessarily work the other way around as strongly. Head-to-head, in head-to-head studies, prize-based, voucher-based, they seem to come out quite the same with those kind of like moderate and sometimes large effect sizes, which means the strength of the intervention. So key features, we've just gone through a very quick tour on our journey, looking at a couple of major programs, 2 really big ones that are all happening in the US, as you'll see, but there's also studies if you're interested in Europe, so countries like Spain, Iran has done studies on contingency management, Vietnam has done studies as well. So there's quite South Africa, so there's quite a wide range with both countries and also ethnic groups. There's even a study that looks at low income and high income countries to see if there's any effect from that in terms of how this particularly works. Key features that you might already be starting to see in what is this approach, contingency management. One is that there's a clearly defined contingent behavior, attendance, a negative urine test. They also, the literature really emphasizes that you're better off going for one class of drug or one type of drug rather than trying to go across, a huge spectrum. That just starts to create all sorts of difficulties in people achieving the behavior, achieving the incentives then, and therefore losing what is a primary mechanism here that's trying to influence change. There needs to be the ability to verify and measure. There needs to be incentives that are available that are sufficient. They need to be tangible, they need to be sufficient, they need to be adequate, they need to have magnitude. More on that in a few moments' time. Sometimes those incentives, if they are monetary value based, they're either flat or cumulative. So it could be $10 for each one, or $5 for each one, or it could be $5 this week, it could be $6.50 the next week, and accumulating based on a bonus of consecutive tests. Frequency of reinforcement, that needs to be happening at a rate of at least twice per week is what's recommended, particularly in the early stages. If you're trying to change what is a fairly entrenched behaviour, needs to be happening. It needs also to be immediate. So we are avoiding delay discounting. So what often can happen with substance use is that longer term rewards are often put off for the more immediate. So this is actually mirroring some of this to try and help to influence change. Magnitude of reinforcement I mentioned. In case we run out of time, you'd really have to do your research if you're looking at doing this, because there's quite a different variation and range of, if we're talking about just monetary value or monetary equivalent, sort of what comes out in the literature is between about $900 and $1,200, but that's US dollars. But luckily, I'll be able to let you know that there's some good stuff happening in Australia to start to find out, well, what does that mean for here? I know I'm kind of skipping over a few things, but yeah, this is definitely the 12-day tour of Europe. Find the highlights, come back, and we can spend some more time and get in contact on some of those things that you really liked. Timing of reinforcement needs to follow the behavior, so that those things become, it is actually kind of a tangible, there's saliency in the reinforcement. And there also needs to be this element of response cost or extinction reinforcement. This, without getting into the technicalities, having to have that conversation if anybody wants to. This is not punishment in a sense, but that idea of the reset, withholding the incentive when the behavior is not present, whilst maintaining a supportive attitude. Incredibly important because of a lot of reasons. So again, moving on, McPherson in 2022, in kind of looking at a bit of an analysis of all the, a lot of the research, and this is why there's so much popularity. Popularity is probably not the right word, but so much interest. You can, in the last 5 years, you can probably find at least 5 major systemic and meta-analyses on this particular topic. It's quite ginormous, the amount of research, but they pulled together and looked at some of the 3 key optimized things that optimize contingency management utility. It's that twice weekly, it's that shorter delay and the between the behavior and the reinforcer to try and avoid that delay discounting, and the magnitude of the reinforcer is important. So for those of you at home today, you're not probably aware that, but there was a little bit of an invitation to the building that we're in here and to my colleagues to invite people along today. And as part of that email, there was an indication that we're going to do a little bit of a contingency management demonstration. So, and that was if people arrived by 10 o'clock, which was the Queensland time, of course, the start time of the webinar, that they were able to draw from a fishbowl. Now, in that fishbowl, we've adapted this because I probably wasn't going to sit down and write 250 affirming statements, and we don't have a large crowd in the room, but we have the elements of a prize-based approach here. We have 50 cards, of which there is a 50-50 ratio, so we're following the protocol here, 25 with a statement, and 25 with a tangible reward. In terms of what those tangible rewards are, if somebody comes and opens their envelope in a few moments' time and has a green ticket, you'll be able to pick from table 1 back there, which means because we've gone deep into the Insight training cupboard, you will get an Insight pad and pen. But you can choose the color of the pen. If you go through and open your envelope, because we have 20 small rewards, roughly about a $2 monetary equivalent value, you know, stop the thanks now, you can thank me later. Then we have 4 again, following the protocol, we actually have 4 pink tickets, which will give you equivalent value of about $10, which you'll receive not only a pen, but a coveted insight cup. Okay, it's actually in a box too. It's not this one because this still got my tea in it. You don't want that one. And finally, there's one jumbo, equivalent of about $20, which is the pad, the pen, the mug, as well as also a nice big box of chocolates that's been donated. That definitely wasn't in the inside training cupboard. It wouldn't last. So now for you who are at home, we've also drawn one for you. Okay, so we'll come and open that and see where you've ended up in a few moments' time. But I'd just like to ask, I've got people in the room here who received one because they got here by 10. There's another couple of people in the room here who weren't here by 10. It's lovely to have you, okay? It's really nice that you're here. That's really good that you came along. So please open. Go ahead and open. And I'll let you know at home because I won't swing the camera around because I'll lose the technology. Oh, wow, we have somebody who's got we have someone who's got an affirming statement. We've got somebody who has one of our large prizes. You get the mug and the cup. Welcome. And we have somebody who's also got a small. Wow, look at the ratios of that. Yeah, this is a prize-winning machine. No, thank you for that. And for you at home, let's open your envelope. For those of you that were here by 10. Oh, great job for being here by 10. Well done. Okay, just a little bit of fun to bring that in. Where we deviated from a standard prize-based contingency management protocol there was that in usual with the draws, so say if you have 1 draw or by bonus you're up to 8 or 10 draws, each time you put the ticket back in, so the odds stay the same for each draw. We didn't do that because there's a bit of a delay here, people arriving at 10 and opening later on. So there was a little bit of a deviation from a standard protocol. So thank you for those at home who put up with that. So, you can all pick your prizes later. And what a shame no one got the jumbo. Terrible, terrible. And just to let you know, that was our fishbowl. So it's not anything particularly sophisticated. So now, that's a bit of a knowledge check. I'm going to go to you at home first, and Ben, who's facilitating our webinar today, he's going to be able to jump on and let me know what type of approach was that we just did. There's 2 types, remember? So for those at home, feel free to type in the chat, and Ben, as soon as you get some answers, can you jump on? Because I know not everyone will see what's coming up in the chat.
We have some answers coming through. Would you like me to just read them out?
Yeah, just read them. Yeah.
So prize-based, say 2 people. I think you spoke before about negative reinforcement. More people saying, there's a lot of people saying prize-based.
Yeah, absolutely. And you got it right. It is absolutely prize-based. So we're learning here. Well done. Not only have we learned some Italian, we're also learning some facets and elements of contingency management. It's prize-based. What was the target contingent behavior? In the room. I'll come to the room. Arrive, attendance, and attendance on time by 10 o'clock. Yes, I actually was trained in a program over in LA back in 2009. And the way they did it, they put chocolates out in the room and then withdrew them at start time. So we didn't repeat that when we introduced that program over here, but they were using that as a similar approach. On-time attendance. Was there ability to measure and verify that behavior that we were targeting? Yes, I had my eyes on who was in the room. But again, really happy that you're here if you didn't make it on time. So it was a visual observation, or you could use attendance sheets or roles. We're not into that. Incentives, I think we saw those. It was a 50-50 ratio fishbowl with 50% redeemable with some equivalent of an amazing, amazing reward. And frequency of reinforcement, in this case, because we haven't spoken about it, it was actually a one-off frequency because it's about one particular behaviour on one occasion. This is used a lot. This is used in research when you have incentives for people attending. This is often used in health behaviours like, say, point-of-care testing for different types of things where incentives are given or incentives are then given to return to get results. So these kind of one-off type or short-term. The timing of the reinforcement as soon as possible. We had a little bit of a delay because you picked the envelope when you walked in, but it's still fairly close to the behaviour. It was fairly immediate. And did we withhold an incentive? Did we have that? Did we use that extinction reinforcement? Yes, we did. We, fishbowl went away at 10 o'clock. Anyone walking in after that didn't get to have a chance to engage in the draw. But again, we're glad you're here. Thank you. And the results, amazing. So many people. There's a few people in the room. People are busy. So just a couple of other things while we're talking about this, and I'm just keeping an eye on the time because I can talk a lot. Recommended restrictions on some sanctions. Well, obviously things like alcohol and tobacco products. So some of those reloadable kind of gift card arrangements usually have some restrictions on them. Other incentives, things like gambling items, lottery tickets, scratchets. Keep that in mind because we actually just did a little bit of a, kind of a chance thing. Keep that one in mind. Access to treatment. It's not like if you do these things, you'll get into treatment or you'll get into OTP and those sorts of things. And quite importantly, one of the strong restrictions on what's used is things like parenting time and access to children. So that needs to be based on the needs of the child or any risk to the child, not based on the adults kind of side of things. So key mechanisms, let's just quickly unpack these. And again, if you've got the PDF, there's a large amount of sort of references provided to you at the end, about 3.5 pages that you can, explore more if you're wanting to go back to Rome or Venice in this kind of quick tour around the world. So one of the key mechanisms that's been identified from all the research is how the reinforcer, particularly immediately given a couple of times a week, the frequency of it, can help to compete with, that should be compete, not complete, and displace the reinforcement that's associated with the substance use, helping to reorient to other rewards. It engages decision-making processes with people if they are starting to kind of see that there's potential consequences one way or the other, as well as it also provides immediate rewards, that overcoming that kind of delayed discounting that I mentioned before, where we're starting to see that, the salience of the immediacy of the drug rewards can somehow potentially be competed with by other options that are more immediate and aren't about long-term outcomes. Help support people to have periods of time where there's less use or no use to help kind of re-engage those kind of brain self-regulation and start to kind of have some healing. These are the mechanisms that are shown. And it also improves engagement and retention. And there's so much literature about how longer periods of time in treatment or engagement in treatment equals outcomes. So the evidence, this is going to be a pretty brief, real tour because it's a giant mountain. I have heard many times that cognitive behavior therapy, and actually this fits under the umbrella of cognitive behavior therapies. It's in there with CBT for alcohol and drug. It's in there with your acceptance and commitment theory. It's in with your DBT. It just moves the dial much more towards the behavior therapy or behavior theory approach of that big, huge umbrella that encompasses a lot of our psychosocial treatments. There is a giant mountain of evidence. I've heard that CBT has probably the most evidence because it maybe, for the different reasons of how it fits into study protocols. I reckon there's a lot more on contingency management. Some of the evidence, I'm just going to give you a really quick tour here, but all the references are here. Like I said, you can find multiple systemic and meta-analytic studies that are done in recent times that has higher rates of treatment retention and higher rates of drug-free urines where abstinence is the contingent behaviour than treatment as usual. Much greater effect sizes it keeps coming out on top of during the primary treatment phase. It's been effective for stimulant disorders particularly. In fact, it keeps coming out as the strongest across the field, and I'll show you a little bit of a good paper about that in a few moments' time. It's often also used in opiate treatment to help support medication adherence, has good effect there, not first-line treatment. Contingency management is never first line for opiate dependence disorders. That is still your pharmacotherapies, your opiate treatments, your medications. It also has been shown with young people when you're looking at it incentivizing attendance has helped people to young people to increase completion rates in studies. That's in treatment. That's a recent one that was published only this year. Just a little bit of a prelude to some comments I'll make at the end is that whilst contingency management shows really good primary treatment results, there is always a kind of not a complete return to baseline, but when the reinforcements stop, which is one of the criticisms and the concerns, and one of the comments that's often made about this, those effects can diminish over time. However, there is some more recent research, particularly the work that was done by Ginley and co, starting to look at the fact that there is still an effect, an odds ratio, greater and above treatment as usual in most cases, even after sort of 3, 6, 12, and that study was done particularly at 12 months. So to address this is where some of these adaptations are starting to happen. And instead of these standard 12-week protocols, which have been used for a lot of historically, whenever these things have been run, they're starting to look at much longer periods of time. You saw the Californian one was 24 weeks, and it had a taper where frequency of testing reduced, so did sort of the frequency of rewards, but they were kind of decreasing until that last little hit at the end. So this is the study that was done by Mike Farrell, involved a lot of good heavy hitters around the world and Australia as well. There's actually a webinar on this one that was presented about looking at globally all the sort of treatments that are available, pharmacological, psychosocial for stimulant use problems, and contingency management came out very much on top of that. And in fact, to even expand that further, contingency management plus things like MI, contingency management plus things like CBT and community reinforcement approaches. If you're not sure of that one, if we get time, I'll touch on it. As you see there, it's kind of almost double the odds ratio, so that the change occurred almost at double rates with people where these things were included, but usually not a standalone treatment. You'll see that. So that is a very giant, quick look at some of the evidence. It's all there. The Asher Rani study from 2021, if anyone is interested, and it is referenced in the list, it's a really good one because it gives you this giant kind of lovely visual table of pretty much nearly every treatment in that's available in alcohol and drug world, and is just pulls together so much evidence and gives you a real simple indication about whether it had an effect or not. And the contingency management, the comment they made about contingency management was it's the one that showed the most robust effect, and it had the better quality of evidence. It is something that is fairly amenable to be studied and researched under conditions like that. So a chance here to pause and reflect, because I've been talking a lot, people in the room, people at home. As I said before, sometimes this can kind of bring up a lot of emotional thoughts, but what about this? But what about that? Or that's not comfortable for me. You know, paying people and those sorts of things. Paying people to come to treatment, paying people to not use drugs, those types of things, paying people to go and get health checks and those sorts of things. Does that fit right with people? While you're sitting with that, and I'm not here to change anyone's views or to say that there is one way to look at this, but I just want to let you know that contingency management doesn't only exist in the area of AOD treatment. It's quite broad, and I've just pulled a couple of things here. For young people, juveniles, adherence to glycemic monitoring in diabetes. Interesting, if you look at that study, it was about things like giving game time and stuff like that. So sorry, parents who maybe feel that might create some emotions, I'm not sure. Weight loss and dietary habits, as we've seen there, really quite a lot of building evidence in the area of co-occurring conditions across mental health and AOD. Improving vaccination rates, again, sorry, some emotion with that probably, but a lot of these were like for childhood vaccination rates and those sorts of things. I won't go into the details of all of those, but there are links if you want to look at them. But also contingency management's been in everyday life forever. Have you ever had this said to you at any time in your life? If you eat your vegetables, you can have dessert. I have. Study there by my mother, when that was, forever and a long time. It's actually known as the Premax principle, where there's that differential probability hypothesis, that idea that you reinforce a target behavior by giving a privilege that happens later. So that's all very much in the field of contingency management, as well as this one, potty presence. In terms of children, potty training and things like that. My buddy talked to me about that this year. Matchbox cars were the prize to have his young son to start to do it. So contingency management kind of is happening in so many different ways. So why then why aren't we seeing it in AOD in a lot of the case? We're starting to see a bit of a building kind of interest and base, mainly because, particularly in the US, they've had a 50-fold increase in the last 10 years of stimulant overdoses, and a lot of deaths associated with that. About 47% of those are associated with stimulants and fentanyl and those types of substances. But there's been a massive increase in health impacts, poor health outcomes, and overdoses in relation to stimulants. So, that's why there's so much interest in this, because this one keeps coming out, particularly with stimulants, as really just in front of the pack, usually, again, bundled up with other things. But why don't we see a lot of it? And some of that might be what you're already kind of thinking when I asked you to pause and reflect. In 2017, I was part of a team that was helping to project manage the re-establishment of the Queensland Drug Court when it recommenced in January 2018. We went down to Victoria in about October, November from memory. This was in the Daily Mail down in Victoria in September of 2017, so about 2 months before we got there. They'd used the fishbowl approach. They had organisations like the AFL donating tickets, so they were included in the incentives of being able to pull. You get AFL tickets, pretty okay, but it got out, and this is the sort of headline. So they've gone back to things like they have a prize shop, which is at Corrective Services Officer, or it was in 2017 when I was there, where it's your toothpaste, your toothbrushes, soap, deodorant, those sorts of things that can be redeemed depending on your awards. So that comes up. Luckily, and also what else kind of comes up around this? So public reaction, but also really interesting. And Dr. Simon Clay and colleagues, and Simon's been a very good friend of Insight Here and has presented here in the past. He's actually been the principal author amongst, as you see, some other very heavy hitters there around Australia, starting to look at perspectives from a lived experience point of view around contingency management as a particular type of intervention, as well as also looking at reflections from health workers as well. Some very 2023 and 2024 for these two studies, so quite recently. So love the fact that it's starting to get the voice of a full picture here and the voice of lived experience as well. So what did they find in this? I'm just going to go through a couple. This is not, read the papers if you want to get them. There's some brilliant quotes in there, and they're all on free kind of download, whatever you call that. So free text articles. So this is from the workers' perspectives. This might be some things that you might be thinking about. Things like, well, what if the person's got a preference for harm reduction? We've got a great harm reduction kind of underpinning our work here in Australia, and this seems to talk a lot about abstinence. Also, what about resets? They might provoke a lapse or a relapse in a way, that idea of kind of like, bit of a pause to what's going on, a bit of a having to provide a positive test. Focus on abstinence. It only promotes sort of one part of life. Doesn't feel right to pay people to attend treatment. There's a lot of uncomfortableness with that when you start to have conversations with people. Might shift the therapeutic relationship from a therapeutic one to a material one, where I've got some, increasing that power imbalance that kind of already exists that we're always trying to deal with. And some clients prefer a harm reduction. This was from the workers' perspective. I'm quickly going to go to the clients, and this was 30 clients across a number of states who were interviewed. It was 6 focus groups for the workers across 3 states. I think it was 2 states for the lived experience perspectives. Absolutely. But by the way, the workers had a general support for it, but they just had they had all these concerns. For the lived experience perspective, didn't like the idea of a one size fits all, because it needs to, look at different goals. Liked kind of the idea and the concept, and don't neglect other needs. And this is something where a lot of programs, if you're just relying on this, it's ignoring to the detriment of some of those other determinants that makes people well. People still need to have stable housing and safety and all those sorts of things. So don't rely on these things alone. Preference for voucher-based case management rather than prize-based, but that it's kind of like, it was more people said this than that, but there was a spectrum of both. Concern that prize-based could be a bit of a form of gambling, and that might be a bit activating for people who have that as an issue. There was actually a really nice piece written by, I think it's Gagnon, I'm not sure if I'm, or Ganong, not sure if I'm saying that right. And also, here's some other things that people said. Well, if you're going to ask me to kind of go to, if it's abstinence-based, you're going to need to give me some pharmacological support. We also need a larger framework than just, an intervention, and the frequency. Just very quickly, and I see that my time is almost up, and Ben's popped on there. Thank you for that. Just reading through that, these are some of the things that are coming out from the research now. If contingency management's being brought into kind of this decade and where it might be used and the learnings from that 30 years, what we're starting to see is, recommendations and protocols. And there's a really good, that those authors there have just written this. It's only just been published, I think, in April. It's probably even after that. Looking at, the durations need to be extended. They need to have looking at how to incorporate harm reduction frameworks. There's not a lot of, there needs to be research on that, because how do you do that? How do you measure that? How do you verify that? That's not yet been determined. Changing reinforcement schedules to be able to take into account reduction goals. Investing further in virtual remote, because it's a big thing to go to a clinic twice a week. Rules out if you're living far away. So technologies like transdermal monitoring, apps that use kind of video recording of things, facial recognition for different types of testing, oral fluid and that sort of thing. Introducing a tapering period is also what's been coming out of the research as something that helps put the behavior on extinction. Put the kind of the undesired behavior on this extinction, and adapting case management to culturally responsive. You're looking at incentives, ask the people what's important to them and match those incentives in a way that then makes it quite powerful. There's a bit of research coming that I'm not sure where it's at. Rebecca McKetton, Associate Professor Rebecca McKetton is the primary author on this, looking at, okay, well, if we were going to do it in Australia for stimulant use, because we don't, because it's a strong evidence base. Do we deny doing this just because maybe we have kind of issues about it? They're looking at, well, what's a model for Australia that would work? So that research is underway. Also, Dr. Tony Barnett, another good friend of Insight, who did a webinar not that long ago in September looking at consumer experiences around long-acting injectables. He's actually currently recruiting for a study, some new research looking at youth clinicians or youth workers' views about contingency management and AOD treatment. That is for any Queensland or New South Wales-based worker, and Tony's details are there. And I think Ben, who's our moderator, might be popping that into the chat. Ben, not you, Ben. Ben in the other room, got two Bens. So feel free to get in contact with Tony to find out more about that. Also, obviously you can contact him for interest, but overall you would need the permission of your organisation to actually go forward and be part of that study. If anyone is looking at thinking about this, these are my suggestions, and this is also from a lot of authors that I've read. Fidelity, fidelity, fidelity. Do your research. This is like it's a policy approach almost within organisations if you're going to do this sort of thing. Find out what are the magnitudes of things that work. There's not a lot of Australian-based research to the level of what we've seen from around the world, in the US in particular. Work on organisational buy-in. That has to be really spoken about, because this is a philosophical approach that often causes some discomfort for people. So those conversations need to be had and worked through, and the evidence that happened in California. They've done a lot of surveys. People had a lot of concerns. They've surveyed them 2 years later, and it's like within the 93 to 96% of those things has not come true in terms of people adulterating urine tests and all these sorts of things that people had concern about. And thinking about your target behaviour, your population, your choice. And luckily, and there's some good evidence now and some good examples where that's user-centred, as in like, not people who use, well, people who use services is the perspective there, actually engaging them in the development of protocols to make them meaningful, engaging workers, engaging people like that. We didn't get time to talk about community reinforcement approach, which often goes really good with contingency management. That might be another webinar. No, scratch that. But not anytime soon. Over to you. Sorry, Ben, I haven't left you with much. It's 11 o'clock. If anyone needs to go, I understand, but maybe we'll hang around for 5 minutes of questions for anyone that has them. I'll go to you first.
Thank you very much. There's a couple of different questions here. We won't get time for all of them, but probably, and for being on time, very good. But for those who didn't, it's lovely to have you here. The probably one of the big ones was a couple of people asking around the reinforcement schedule. So people had heard that maybe a more random or intermittent reinforcement schedule may be perhaps more powerful. Had you heard anything about that?
Oh, look, I can understand the principles of that. I haven't seen anything, come across anything specific. However, what the prevailing kind of thought is, if we're competing with the kind of the timing of rewards that come through drug use, having something that's immediate after the behaviour has been demonstrated and verified is the recommended approach. And I'm wondering, and this is just my theory, I'm wondering if that prize-based introduces some of that, because it is a bit of a random reinforcement schedule, which I understand, as I know, that often reinforces behaviour when you don't necessarily know when it's going to kind of the reward is going to be received. But beyond that, I get to use my card that says, I don't know if intermittent, but there's been nothing written about using intermittent that I've ever read as the best way to reinforce. In fact, probably to overcome delayed discounting, I think you almost need 1-for-1, because drugs do the 1-for-1. So we're actually competing with that same 1-for-1 ratio, behavior reward. Yeah.
Thank you. That makes total sense. There's a couple more questions here, but would you like to see if there's
to go to the room here, any question? And again, if anyone has to go, fully understand, but happy to hang around for a few more minutes because I did talk longer than... No questions in the room? That's okay. Everyone's just excited about their rewards they've received. No, thank you, Carl, for being ready with the mic. Ben, back to you.
So another couple of people kind of were asking around a concern that you raised in that end section around kind of worker perspectives. Just querying whether there may be an overlap between a contingency management approach and maybe the impact on gambling, and if people already have difficulties with gambling as part of what brings them into services.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one, again, as an ethical issue, I think it's quite a real one, that it does rise up to those questions. So that might be something that would be part of that fidelity preparation, looking at your client group. And we know there's a nexus actually between stimulus use and kind of gambling type behavior. There is that kind of nexus as well. So it would be one that I would me myself, if I was looking at implanting, I'd wait till some of that research was done around what's a model in Australia that fits. Just remember as well, from the little bit of window we have into that at the moment, is that the people who use methamphetamine, their perspective was, it was a small focus group approach, was for the voucher-based, because of those same very concerns. So I think that needs to be heard and listened to, and considered which approach we use based on the clients we're working with. Absolutely, yeah.
There are a couple of other questions, but perhaps we may leave it there. A lot of comments saying thank you, very grateful for the presentation. So I won't have time to read all those out, but they are there. Everyone, I will pass all the other questions and comments on to James after this webinar, so he'll get to see those either way. But thank you, James, for presenting this webinar today. It was very interesting and definitely generated a lot of chat. We hope to see you all in webinar land and in the room there as well next Wednesday for the next webinar. It's going to be presented by Dr. Benjamin Riordan, and it's called Life Imitating Art or Art Imitating Life. How is substance use portrayed in digital media and what impacts can it have? So join us for that. Thank you again, James, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their week.
Thank you all. Bye now.